Ever heard of an airplane? Kind of designed to crash. Okay, maybe not designed to crash, but, built to help you walk away from one.
That's what we're kind of unpacking today, the
Mm.
Burnelli lifting fuselage.
It's a fascinating story about an often overlooked chapter in aviation history.
We're talking about Vincent Burnelli, this Texan engineer who was absolutely convinced he cracked the code to safer, more efficient flight.
His big idea.
The fuselage, the main body of the plane, shouldn't just hold things.
Right.
It should help the plane fly.
I have to admit, I'm picturing a flying Winnebago right now. We've got articles from Aerotime and Smithsonian Magazine, plus Burnelli's Wikipedia entry to guide us. So what's the deal with this lifting fuselage? Was Burnelli a genius, a crackpot, or somewhere in between?
Let's start with the basics. Most planes rely on their wings, shaped like airfoils, to generate lift.
Okay.
Think of an airfoil like a bird's wing. That curved shape is what makes air flow faster over the top, creating low pressure and pulling the wing, and thus the plane, upwards. That makes sense, but Burnelli didn't just want the wings to be airfoils, right?
Exactly. He thought, why not make the entire fuselage contribute to lift?
Hmm.
So instead of a narrow tube, imagine a wider, more rounded body, almost like a pelican in flight.
So it's not just the wings doing the heavy lifting, it's the whole plane. That's a pretty radical idea, especially back in the 1920s. Did he actually build planes this way?
He did. His early biplanes were quite a sight, with these incredibly wide fuselages. And Burnelli was a showman.
Really?
The Aerotime article talks about how he once used his RB-2, one of his early designs, to fly a Hudson-Essex automobile around on a sales tour.
Talk about an attention-grabbing marketing campaign. So if his designs were so great, why aren't we all flying around in Burnelli planes today?
That's where the story takes a turn. While Burnelli was a gifted engineer, he was also known for being, well, notoriously difficult to work with.
Oh, tell me more.
The Smithsonian article paints a picture of a man who was brilliant but fiercely protective of his ideas, sometimes to his detriment. He was known to alienate potential investors and partners.
So it sounds like his personality might have been as big as his airplanes?
You could say that. And this is where things get really interesting, even veering into conspiracy theory territory. Enter Chalmers' Slick Goodwin,
Okay.
a test pilot who became Burnelli's biggest champion, but also his most vocal accuser.
Wait, hold on.
Are you saying Boeing might have stolen his ideas? Is there any proof of that?
Goodwin was absolutely convinced. He believed major companies, particularly Boeing, recognized the brilliance of Burnelli's lifting fuselage, but conspired to suppress it.
That's quite an accusation. Why would they do that?
Goodwin claimed they didn't want to pay royalties or admit that a relative unknown had beaten them to the punch. He even pointed to Boeing's later 754 Husky cargo plane, which does bear a resemblance to Burnelli's designs, as evidence.
Hmm. So is that it? Was Burnelli a genius, cheated by a corrupt system? Or is there more to this story?
It's rarely that simple. To understand why Burnelli's planes never went mainstream, we need to look at the supposed advantages of his designs, particularly when it came to safety and performance.
All right, let's dive into that.
Hmm.
What were the selling points of a Burnelli plane?
Well, if there's one thing Burnelli constantly emphasized, it was safety. He truly believed his planes were inherently safer than traditional designs, and he had some compelling arguments.
Like what?
First, that wider, boxier fuselage.
Right.
Burnelli insisted it offered greater structural integrity. Imagine a car crash, you'd feel safer in a tank than a compact car, right?
Sure.
He believed the same principle applied to airplanes.
So a sturdier design overall. What else?
He was also strategic about weight distribution. For example, the engines were often positioned closer together and further forward on the fuselage, away from the passenger cabin.
Okay.
This, he argued, reduced the risk of fire in the event of a crash.
Okay, that makes sense. Keep those engines as far away from me as possible, especially if we crash.
Exactly. Now, some of Burnelli's supporters even claimed his planes could survive water landings because of that wide, buoyant fuselage.
So safer in the air and on water. It sounds almost too good to be true. Were there any downsides to his designs?
There were trade-offs, as there always are with engineering. While those safety features were innovative, they weren't necessarily exclusive to Burnelli's designs.
What do you mean?
Well, you could theoretically build a conventional plane with a reinforced fuselage or relocate the fuel tanks to make it safer. And that's what a lot of manufacturers were doing as safety regulations advanced.
So Burnelli's safety features, while impressive, weren't entirely unique. Where did his designs fall short?
Well, that boxy fuselage design, while potentially stronger, created more drag.
Drag. Explain that to me like I'm 5.
Okay. Imagine you're trying to push a cardboard box through water.
Okay.
It's not going to be easy, right?
Right.
That box creates a lot of resistance. That's drag. Now, try pushing a streamlined fish through the water. Much easier. Burnelli's planes were more like the box. They needed more power to cut through the air compared to sleeker, more aerodynamic designs.
And more power means burning more fuel, which means higher costs.
Right.
That's a pretty big downside, especially for airlines.
Exactly. The Airtime article argues that this inherent drag penalty would make it nearly impossible for Burnelli's planes to compete with the sleeker designs that were popping up, especially as the jet age was taking off.
Makes sense. Airlines are all about efficiency. But what about the passenger experience?
Were Burnelli's planes comfortable?
That's another interesting point. Burnelli was adamant that his designs offered more spacious cabins, which, let's face it, is always a win in my book.
Oh, absolutely. Legroom for days.
Right. But think about the image of air travel in the jet age. It was all about speed and glamour. People wanted to get to their destinations faster. And they associated sleek, futuristic designs with that progress. A Burnelli plane, even if it was roomy and safe, might not have captured that same sense of excitement.
So it's not just about the technology itself, but how it's perceived and marketed.
Absolutely. It's like the difference between a station wagon and a sports car. They both get you there, but they project very different images.
So if Burnelli's planes weren't faster or more cost-effective and maybe didn't have that wow factor, did any of his ideas catch on?
Actually, yes. It's interesting how some of his concepts popped up in unexpected places. Remember the lifting body design we talked about?
How could I forget? A whole plane that's basically a giant wing.
Well, that idea has been utilized in military aircraft, specifically in experimental planes and some fighter jets. Distributing lift across more of the aircraft's surface has its advantages in certain applications.
And there's that cargo drone, the LCRA, that was featured in the Aerotime article. It has that distinctive wide fuselage, very Burnelli-esque, right? And it was designed to carry medical supplies, which seems fitting given Burnelli's focus on safety.
That's right. The LTRA project is a great example of how some of Burnelli's ideas are finding new life in the 21st century, even if his original planes never dominated the skies.
It's kind of like his legacy lives on in those designs. But speaking of legacy, we can't ignore this idea that his personality might have held him back.
It's certainly a factor. The Smithsonian article doesn't shy away from describing his more difficult traits.
Yeah.
Confrontational, suspicious, and unwilling to compromise. Those qualities didn't serve him well in the world of business and collaboration.
It makes you wonder, what if he had been a different kind of person? Could he have achieved greater success if he had been more open to collaboration or willing to play the political game?
It's impossible to know for sure. But what we can learn from Burnelli's story is that innovation isn't always a straight line from brilliant idea to widespread adoption.
So it's not enough to just have a great idea. You need the right combination of vision, business savvy, and maybe even a little bit of luck to really make a lasting impact.
Exactly. And sometimes even those things aren't enough.
Now that's a sobering thought. But before we get too down on the unpredictable nature of innovation, there's one more part of Burnelli's story I want to unpack. This almost unbelievable tale of a plane crash. So we've talked about Burnelli's vision and the controversy and the ups and downs of his career. But there's this one story, this plane crash, that really gets to the heart of what his designs were all about.
You're talking about the 1935 crash at the UB-14.
Yeah.
It's a pretty dramatic example of Burnelli's design philosophy put to the test.
It sounds insane. The Smithsonian article said the plane went down at something like 130 miles per hour.
It was a violent crash. The plane hit the ground wing first, and the impact was, as you can imagine, severe. The engines were torn off, the wings were sheared, even the tail section was ripped apart.
I'm getting anxious just hearing you describe this. How could anyone survive that?
That's the incredible part.
Yeah.
While the rest of the plane was practically disintegrated, the fuselage, that sturdy box-like structure that Burnelli was so proud of, remained largely intact.
Wait, are you saying what I think you're saying? They walked away from that.
Well, maybe not walked away.
But incredibly, the crew did survive.
That's wild. It really speaks to Burnelli's whole thing about building planes that could take a hit.
It's certainly compelling, but it's also just one incident. It's hard to say for certain whether this level of crashworthiness was inherent to the lifting fuselage design itself or just a stroke of luck.
I guess even the safest design can't always guarantee a perfect outcome. And And to be fair, it's not like planes are crashing all the time these days. We've come a long way since the 1930s.
That's a good point. Since the early days of aviation, the focus has shifted from simply trying to survive crashes to preventing them altogether.
Makes sense. So instead of just building a super strong plane, the emphasis is more on making sure crashes don't happen in the first place.
Exactly. Think about all the advances we've seen. Air traffic control, radar, sophisticated navigation systems, weather forecasting, stricter pilot training. These have all played a huge role in making air travel incredibly safe.
So where does that leave Vincent Burnelli in the grand scheme of aviation history? Was he a visionary who was just ahead of his time, or was he too stuck in his ways to adapt?
It's probably a bit of both. Burnelli was undoubtedly a brilliant engineer who dared to challenge the status quo. He had a radical vision for safer air travel, and he pursued it relentlessly even when others doubted him.
But his stubbornness, his inability to compromise or play the political game, that clearly held him back. It makes you think about all the what ifs. What if he had been a different kind of person, more collaborative, less likely to see conspiracies everywhere? Could his planes be flying today?
It's a fascinating question, but what we can learn from his story is that innovation is a complex process. It requires not just technical brilliance, but also the ability to navigate the realities of business, collaboration, and even a bit of luck.
And sometimes even then, it's still not enough.
That's the hard truth. But Bernelli's story is a reminder that even if an idea doesn't change the world in the way its creator envisioned, it can still spark new ideas and inspire future generations. And who knows, maybe those flying wings will take to the skies again someday in a way Bernelli never imagined.
Now that's a thought. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from radical aircraft designs to conspiracy theories to the evolving nature of aviation safety. If you want to learn more about Vincent Burnelli and see some of his incredible designs, we've got links to articles, photos, and even videos in the show notes.
It's a fascinating glimpse into a lesser-known chapter of aviation history.
And as we wrap up our deep dive, here's a final question to ponder. Would you fly in a Burnelli plane, knowing what you know now? Would you trade speed and efficiency for the promise of a bumpier but potentially safer ride?
It really makes you think about what we value most when we step on an airplane.
That's all for today's deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and never stop learning.